Hello and welcome back. This is the week 12 lecture. So we return to documentary filmmaking this week. This will be our final documentary, of course, Hoop Dreams. It came out in 1994, so 94 is a big year for us. We've already seen Go Fish, Pulp Fiction, and Clerks, all of which came out in the same year. So Hoop Dreams is obviously a very different type of film compared to what we've been watching recently. We can go back and compare it a little bit to Roger and Me and The Thin Blue Line, the two earlier documentaries that we watched. But this film became very popular, is generally regarded as one of the best American documentaries ever made. It's frequently thought of as one of the most successful documentaries ever made in America. Very successful, acclaimed, and one of the most watched documentaries. That's kind of an unofficial statistic, but I would say that's probably true. So the director here is Steve James. Obviously, the stars are William Gates and Arthur Agee, these two young men growing up in Chicago who are sort of schoolboy basketball stars, and we follow them throughout their high school basketball careers. They, of course, are the ones with the hoop dreams. So this film resonated with people in a lot of ways, and I think we can see some of those ways. It has a lot of familiar sports movie tropes that we can identify, that we recognize, and I think in a lot of ways this movie kind of reminds us why a lot of those familiar sports movie tropes, which even feel a little cliche sometimes in sports movies, in typical, fiction films, we can see why they work though, because they often do have a basis in real life, and we sort of see real life analogs to a lot of what we might see in movies, in fiction movies. So this film, I think it does that. It gets us inside the lives of these two characters, and that's very compelling. That's what some of the best fiction does as well. So I think we can definitely see how the film is compelling in that way. The film has an interesting story just in terms of how it got made as well. So I wanted to start with that before we actually turn to the content of the film. So like I said, directed by Steve James, produced by James, his friend Frederick Marks, and there's a third guy. I thought I wrote him down, but oh yeah, Peter Gilbert. Don't know much about him, but James was the director, and Marks handled a lot of the editing. So those two guys were friends and had worked together before. So this film kind of starts out with very modest goals. It kind of has a small scope initially, which it then transcends. And like I said, it becomes this very big movie, certainly bigger than average documentaries in this country. So it's kind of an underdog story, the making of the film. It's kind of an underdog story, a little bit similar to the story of Marshall High, Arthur's team, as they make a run in the state playoffs. So just a quick backstory. James was just sort of a weekend warrior, big basketball fan. He was like a recreational basketball player. He apparently got the idea just sort of watching pickup games in gyms and playgrounds, and he approached his friend Marks with this idea to just do a short 30-minute documentary focusing on one sort of public playground in Chicago, like one group of players who they meet, sort of playing on this playground, and just kind of following up some of those guys, documenting some of those games, and just sort of giving viewers a portrait of sort of basketball culture in inner city Chicago. And how, these players how these, players in the park or in the playground view the game, and we can maybe learn a little bit about their lives. So relatively small scope, just a 30-minute thing focusing on one group at one park or playground. And I think their plan was to sell it to PBS. to air on PBS. So that was their initial story idea, and they got funding from the Illinois Arts Council and Cartimquin or Cartimquin, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Cartimquin Films, which is a non-profit film distribution company based in Chicago that specializes in documentaries. So they got their initial money from those sources and they started working, but I'm not quite sure the chronology. You guys can probably look this up online easily enough. There's a lot of mythology and lore and history surrounding this film and how it got made. But apparently James was put in touch with Gene Pingatore, the head coach at St. Joseph's High School, who we meet in the film. We'll talk about him later. And also Earl Smith, the sort of unofficial talent scout who seems to kind of work in an unofficial capacity for Pingatore and other high school coaches in the area. And basically he goes to inner city playgrounds. We see Smith in action, early in the film. He discovers Arthur, playing at a playground, and, he goes down and scouts these kids who are like 13 years old. They're just finishing middle school, I think, in a lot of cases, or they say grammar school in the film, but it looks like Arthur gets scouted right before he's ready to go into high school, so that's how he ends up going to St. Joseph's for his freshman year. So Earl Smith scouts the inner city playgrounds for kids who might be good enough to play at these elite private schools out in the Chicago suburbs, which are predominantly white, upper middle class areas, of course, as we see with St. Joe's. And this can be a ticket out for a lot of these kids. So obviously that's the narrative here, right? Both William and Arthur are trying to use basketball as their ticket out of their sort of bad neighborhoods and difficult sort of family and financial circumstances. It's their way to get out, and they both end up at St. Joe's, at least initially. So we see all of that play out in the film. But anyway, James got in touch with both Pingatore and Earl Smith, and that's how Steve James came to meet Arthur Agee. And I think maybe through Pingatore, he also learned about William Gates, who was this more highly, heralded, more hyped prospect, who's also going to St. Joe's to start high school. Even though, again, St. Joe's is way out in the suburbs. These kids have to take public transportation to get out there. It's like 90 minutes, some kind of long commute for them to get out there. And it's obviously a sort of culture shock for both of them. But anyway, I keep getting ahead of myself. James meets those guys, and then he meets Agee and Gates and kind of forms a personal relationship with those kids and their families. So the scope of the film grows. I think initially they're just going to focus on Arthur, and then they meet William, and they're like, oh, well, we should probably do some stuff with this kid too, because everybody thinks he's going to be a real star. So they start following both, and again, you guys can read about the history. I think there's a good Wikipedia page on the film, but initially, because they don't have a lot of money, they don't really film a whole lot at first. They can only film for like 2 or 3 weeks in the early going. So like during the kids' freshman years and maybe into their sophomore years, the filmmakers didn't get a ton of footage. But then they started getting some more finance. They got more funding as time went along, and they got money from a lot of different places. Again, they were kind of struggling at times to make ends meet. So a public television station in Minnesota gave them a donation. The Corporation of Public Broadcasting gave them some money. And then also James applied for and got a MacArthur, like a grant from the MacArthur Foundation. It was kind of a famous sort of philanthropic organization. They give money to nonprofits and sometimes to people involved in the arts. So he gets some money from them, and they're able to sort of cobble enough together to keep shooting. So that's kind of why we get a lot more access kind of beginning around junior year for both of the guys. And then we follow them really all pretty intensively all the way until graduation. So they get more money. They realize the film's going to be a lot longer. It's going to be a feature, feature length, and they keep shooting. And but it gets kind of interesting, and it's a little bit like Michael Moore. We can talk about how the filmmakers sort of get involved with their subjects and whether or not that matters. But James, and I think Marks and their other production partner, they kind of do form friendships with the kids, with the families, and just sort of anecdotally from stuff I've heard and read as we see in the film, Arthur's family goes through some really tough times. His dad abandons the family. He leaves. He's going through drug addiction, and he's incarcerated for a while, and the family's really hard up for money. I think his mom gets laid off. They don't have money. They can't pay the bills, and it's not discussed in the film, but what a lot of people have talked about since is that James and some of his partners were able to actually help the family out a little bit. They were able to provide some money to help keep them afloat, I think, until Sheila, Arthur's mom, was able to get employed again. And she kind of becomes a compelling character as well. Again, we learn more than just about the playing careers of these two guys. We learn about their families. We really have incredible access. That's one of the things the film is sort of famous for. But again, does that affect the way we view the film? Does the fact that James has a relationship with the families, does that affect us in any way? You can think about that. But anyway, the film, and I think Pearson mentions it a few times in the book, the film finally, I think they get finished shooting in 91. The kids graduate in 91, but it takes almost 3 years to edit this thing. They have hundreds and hundreds of hours of footage. So as you can imagine, the editing is pretty extensive, and it's a pretty difficult challenge. So it takes them years and years to assemble sort of a coherent narrative out of all of this raw footage. So the film finally debuts at the Sundance Film Festival in 94. Some other big movies were there as well. And while at the film festival, they strike a deal with Fine Line Features, which we've talked about before. Fine Line is the art house division of New Line Cinema, which is a production company that we've talked about before. So like a lot of production companies were doing throughout the 80s and into the 90s, as we've said, they started to see the market for independent film growing. So they created their own indie divisions, their own art house divisions or branches that would specialize in buying and distributing indie films like this one that were often made for relatively cheap, but somebody sees some potential, somebody thinks it might do well, so they buy it. And that's what happens here. So Fine Line buys it, distributes it, it gets a pretty good release, and it makes money. I mean, not on par with some of the other big hits that we've seen, but compared to typical documentaries, it does very well. It grosses about $8 million domestically, and I think closer to 12 maybe internationally. So does well, has a pretty robust home video business. That's how I first saw it. I never saw it in theaters. I watched it at home. I think we rented it from Blockbuster. But it was a film that really became quite popular and talked about, again, both critically acclaimed and just popular amongst a lot of viewers. And a book later came out that I remember reading, I was probably in middle school. Like, it was just part of mid to late 90s culture. Even people who didn't see the film, it's just one of those things, you kind of knew what it was. It kind of entered the lexicon, entered the vocabulary. People knew what Hoop Dreams was. They might have even known who the two main characters were. And of course, I think part of where we get a lot of the drama here is we have a reversal. So I mentioned some of the big sports movie tropes that we kind of see here. We see the underdog player and the underdog team sort of exceeding expectations and having sort of a dramatic turnaround with the Marshall High team. So I want to talk more about that. I think that's a really compelling part of the story, but we have this reversal, right? So the setup, it seems pretty clear. William is the chosen one. He's the one that's expected to be a big success. He seems to be favored by Pingatore and this high-profile program that he runs at St. Joe's. And again, I know a lot of us probably aren't, basketball fans. We might not know some of the names and like references that get thrown around. And once again, the film's a little older, so even if you are a sports fan now, if you're of a younger generation, you might not necessarily know what they're talking about at times. But they mention Isaiah Thomas a lot. He's not super famous anymore, but he was a pretty famous NBA player in the 80s and like early 90s. He was like an early rival of Jordan. But anyway, Thomas is from Chicago, and he went to high school at St. Joe's. He was from the West Side, much like Arthur. And we even see him briefly in the film. They bring him out at that basketball camp to talk to the prospective new class of St. Joe's players. So Thomas was often held up as a success story. He came out of a rough West Side neighborhood, went to St. Joe's, and then ended up playing college basketball at Indiana. For Bob Knight, who I think he's dead now or close to it, but he's a famous college basketball coach from a previous era. And then Thomas went on to have a Hall of Fame career in the NBA playing for the Detroit Pistons. So there's frequent moments in the film where you see Sheila and even Arthur and other characters wearing like Detroit Pistons gear. And I know I've had some people in the past think that maybe they're in Detroit. No, they're in Chicago, but a lot of them are partial to the Pistons because that's the team that Isaiah Thomas played for. So Thomas was a big deal. Like, I mean, we all know Michael Jordan, and we see Jordan. Obviously, he played for the Bulls. So he's obviously an icon and somebody that these kids look up to as well. But Isaiah Thomas is an important figure to keep in mind as well because he's from Chicago. So he didn't play for the Chicago NBA team, but he's actually from Chicago, and he made it. He was a big-time college player, and then he became a star in the NBA. He wasn't as big as Jordan, but before Jordan and the Bulls got really good, Isaiah Thomas and Detroit, at least for a while, they were the best team in the league in the late 80s, and they won a couple of championships. Not that that's terribly important for us to know, but just as a little bit of context, because you see Thomas on posters, and early on, Arthur is even kind of copying some of Thomas's moves, but he's a model of what you could do, how a kid from an inner city neighborhood could get out of there, could use basketball first to get to St. Joe's, and then from St. Joe's to go and play college basketball, and then from there to go to the NBA. So that's kind of the path that these two kids are trying to follow. So we can get more into the content, but yeah, just think about some of those tropes. The underdog story, the reversal though, right? William is the chosen one. Arthur is kind of, and again, they think of William as maybe being the one who's going to follow in Isaiah's footsteps. He's compared to Isaiah Thomas as somebody who can do what Isaiah did. And meanwhile, Arthur, when we first meet him, doesn't seem... at least based on the perception, Pingatore and others don't regard him as being the same kind of sure thing. But I'm always struck at how engaging and sweet Arthur seems to be as a kid, especially in that car ride, when they're first going to St. Joe's. And we hear James, I think it's James, off camera, but asking him, how are you going to feel if you meet Isaiah here, and you see Arthur kind of smile and say how shocked he would be. And it's a sweet moment. He's only 14. He's just a kid. He talks about how it's weird to go this far out. I think that's the phrase or expression he uses. He hasn't often left, the city, and he's going way out into the suburbs. Very different socioeconomic landscape. And at one point, again, with that sort of disarming honesty, that kids have, at one point he says, I've never been around this many white people. It's taking some getting used to when he first starts at St. Joe's because it's just very different, from where he's from, where he's gone to school previously. And the same is true for William. So they're not from the same area. They're obviously both from Chicago, but they're from different neighborhoods. So I'm struck at the very beginning of the film. You know, we get that kind of cheesy opening. It's a little bit dated, you know, with the rap song and like, you know, the slam dunks. But in that opening sequence, we get a lot of views of the city. We get a lot of shots of this urban space of Chicago, and we see all these different courts and these different playgrounds. And it's just, again, we've seen this in a lot of films this year, actually. If we go all the way back to Stranger Than Paradise, we've seen a lot of shots of sort of like urban desolation or decay. We saw that a little bit at the beginning. We've seen it in some other films since, and I think we see it here. You know, right off the bat, we're introduced to inner city Chicago, and we're taken to each of these two guys' neighborhoods. First, Cabrini Green, which is where William lives. That was kind of a notorious housing project in Chicago on the near north side, I want to say. It's gone now. They tore it down. And that's a part of the city that is starting to get gentrified a little bit. So the nature of that area is changing. The landscape is changing a little bit. So we go to Cabrini Green first, and then we go to West Garfield Park on the west side of the city. That's where Arthur is from. So it kind of looks different, right? Cabrini Green is one of those kind of hellacious, high-rise housing project. They built tons of those in big cities in the years kind of like mid 20th century. They're kind of efficient, but huge, and they're eyesores, and they quickly became sort of hotbeds of, you know, crime. So you see those in New York City and Chicago and other northern cities. They got a lot of them were built at around the same time, post-war. A lot of post-war construction. But then West Garfield Park, it feels a little more sort of traditionally residential, you know, houses, a more kind of traditional residential scene, but obviously a bit run down, dilapidated. You know, a suburban area that had been pretty nice in previous eras, but white flight, a lot of economic downturn in the late 20th century created a lot of, you know, it was a sort of disadvantaged area, just like Cabrini Green. So these two different pockets of Chicago, but they're both sort of defined by poverty, high crime rates. So we've kind of heard this story. We're familiar with this sort of narrative, and we know a little bit about these kinds of settings. And in some parts of the country, they've been able to do something about these kinds of places and these kinds of economic problems. In other places, they still persist. So like on the west side of Chicago, you still have a lot of those same problems. But you know, and we've talked about gentrification before. You know, in other urban spaces, gentrification has changed the sort of nature and the economics of some of these neighborhoods and some of these places, which means in a lot of cases lower crime, but a different sort of demographic, older residents being pushed out. So it's a complicated issue, and we certainly don't have to find solutions in this class, but just sort of be aware of it because it's certainly on display in this film. But yeah, just to finally finish my point about the sports tropes, we got, I mentioned the underdog, but also the injury, and yeah, just think about the reversal of fortune as William takes a downturn. You know, he's the star who gets hurt and is maybe never quite the same after that. So kind of a tragic figure in some ways, and maybe in some ways similar to his older brother as well. So we see his downturn kind of coincide with Arthur's unexpected resurgence, and it kind of coincides with Arthur's inner city public high school, Marshall, John Marshall Metro High, you know, on the west side, making this sort of dramatic Cinderella run in the state tournament. So that's the kind of thing that American film viewers love. Again, I know some of us might not really follow basketball, but a lot of you might know that March Madness, the college basketball tournament, just concluded recently. So there's always Cinderellas in that tournament. This year there was a very small school in New Jersey that made it very far in the tournament. And American sports fans really respond to that. It's been well documented. There's been, academic papers written about our love affair with underdog sports teams. And it's not, I wouldn't necessarily say it's uniquely American. I think it's just a part of sports culture that you can probably find in other cultures, other countries with other sports, different sports than the ones we play here. But it is a recurring feature in a lot of American sports cinema. So if we're thinking of sports movies as sort of a genre, again, we can see a lot of the standard ingredients of the screenplays of those kinds of movies present here, in real life. So again, that kind of, I think, reveals to us why they resonate or why some of these tropes work, why they move people. Because in some cases, they really do happen. There really are Cinderella stories. There really are dramatic reversals of fortune. So again, I think the documentary, to a lot of viewers, and even just speaking for myself a little bit, it plays a little bit like a movie. It has the sort of beats and a lot of the moves and the tones that you might expect to find in a fiction film. And the fact that it's real just really brings it home all the more. So I think that's a big reason for its success. But so we get a lot of the inspirational uplift that sports can provide, largely from Arthur's arc, but really just his whole family, the whole family kind of recovers from some of their early struggles. So we see the father, after leaving the family, come back, and he seems to have cleaned up his act. The marriage between Bo and Sheila seems to be troubled, to say the least, but I think they're separated later, but he's still kind of around. But one of my favorite characters is Sheila, and one of the most emotionally charged scenes for me is when she gets her degree as like a nurse's assistant, from that community center, and they have a little ceremony, and she finds out that she has the highest grade in the class, and she cries, and she's very happy, and Arthur's there, along with, I think, a younger brother or some other relative, but it's a very small gathering, but she's so happy, and Arthur's there to share it with her, and she's a very sympathetic figure, I think. We see her kind of holding the family together. She's, a constant in Arthur's life, whereas his dad seems to come and go. He's obviously battling a substance abuse problem, which it seems like he gets a handle on by the end of the film, but we don't know all the details. But yeah, Sheila's a very compelling character to me, but we get such great access to both families, so we get to see sort of how the athletic journeys affect everybody, not just Arthur, not just William, and we're really kind of reminded of the unromantic side of sports at the same time as we get all of this uplift and inspiration. We also are reminded that sports can be really cruel, and players are really only valuable as long as they can play and as long as they're playing really well. So the first kind of indicator that we get of this is, of course, what happens to Arthur, and the fact that he's essentially kicked out of St. Joe's because his family can't make the tuition payments. I think this is after Bo has left. His mom gets laid off. Yeah, so I think they're sort of struggling, again, to say the least, and they're behind on the payments. So Arthur gets booted, and he's actually out of school for a while before he ends up going to Marshall, which is the nearby public school. And we don't have to necessarily agree with this, but it's certainly the opinion of several people in the film. We hear his new coach at Marshall say this, some other people say this. Basically, if Pingatore and the powers that be at St. Joe's were really high on Arthur and his future as a basketball player, they would have made a way, they would have found a way to keep him in school. They would have found a way to get the tuition paid. And the implication, I think, is if he was more like William and valued the way William was and viewed as a future star like William was, they would have produced the money. They would have found a way to keep him in school. I don't know if that's true, but certainly a lot of people feel that way. And you kind of get the feeling that maybe there's a precedent. Maybe they have some evidence to make them feel that way. But also keep in mind, William was getting sort of a better deal. Like they both had scholarships, or at least Arthur had like a partial scholarship. But in addition to William's scholarship, he was getting some money from a community organization at Cabrini Green, the housing project where he's from. So he was getting a little bit more money. I think he was getting a little more financial assistance than Arthur. And this is kind of a theme early on. William's a little bit ahead of Arthur. He seems to be a little more mature physically. As freshman, Arthur has to play on JV, and William's already on the varsity. He's already a good player on the varsity. So people are already talking about William. People are already sort of projecting him as a star, both in high school and college, whereas with Arthur, they're not even sure if he's going to make it to varsity at that point. So the idea is, because they don't see a bright future for Arthur and his family is having financial problems, St. Joe's is done with him. They cut him loose. They don't seem to have a whole lot of regard. And then he lands at Marshall, where he actually does better. He seems to kind of thrive eventually. He has some initial struggles, and we hear the coach. I like the Marshall coach. I can't remember his name, but we hear him talk about how Arthur has to grow up, and it's not dissimilar to what we heard from Pingatore, but we can definitely conduct a comparison between those two coaches. Pingatore, I don't know that he's a bad guy necessarily, but we have to decide how he comes off here. Is he sympathetic? Does he seem to care about the kids? I mean, it's always difficult for me to render judgment, because on one hand, the deal that they're offering at St. Joe's, I can't demonize it completely, and we see that it does work for some players, for some kids, obviously Isaiah Thomas, but even, William, even though his career doesn't go quite the way people think, he still graduates, he still goes on to college, he plays in college, and he's able to ultimately graduate from college. So, the deal works for the kids who are able, frankly, to assimilate, I guess, or adapt to that very different environment. And we see that Pingatore is kind of a disciplinarian. He's very stern. And again, this is part of sports culture that I think some people readily accept, especially if you played sports, if you kind of grew up playing sports. You sort of accept a coach yelling at you and demeaning you in some ways, often sort of humiliating you, embarrassing you. But then if you don't play sports, or if you don't like sports and you don't really dig sports culture, I think a lot of it can seem really destructive and, borderline abusive, or at the very least, just not good behavior. Not maybe an example that you want to set for young people. But but we also see that even for players who are good enough to go and play college, the system doesn't always seem to benefit everybody. So we have a cautionary tales abound. We can look at William's brother Curtis, who I think is a very tragic figure and a very interesting character. Again, doesn't always come off completely favorably, maybe because he's very critical of William, and he's pretty blunt about the fact that he wants to live vicariously through William, because Curtis's own hoop dreams didn't pan out. He was a very good high school player who went to junior college and was very good there, and eventually went to a Division I college to play, but didn't work out, didn't get along with his coach, didn't get a chance to play, and ultimately left school without graduating, goes back to Chicago, doesn't have a lot of legitimate things, frankly, to fall back on. He didn't go to St. Joe's. I don't know what high school Curtis attended, but I would assume it was the local public school. He didn't get a chance to go out and play at St. Joe's, I don't think. But he was still good enough to play college, but talent alone doesn't guarantee lasting success. And Curtis seems very adrift. He's a very melancholy figure, I think. And he does want to sort of counsel and advise William, but it's also very critical again. And it seems like he often makes it about him. William's career is kind of a way for him to feel validated. He says, if people can understand Williams' game, they'll understand, mine, how I played. So he kind of feels underappreciated, or he feels like he should have made it. And we hear that, again, is another recurring feature. Arthur's father says something similar. Oh, I could have played, I could have played in the pros if I had just done this or done that, stayed out of trouble. So there's that great scene later where the coach at Marshall is describing Arthur, and he's saying what he fears is going to happen to Arthur, if he doesn't straighten out. And he's basically describing Arthur's dad. He's saying, yeah, one of these guys who plays high school ball, he's a pretty good player, but never does anything with himself, gets in trouble. And then years later, you hear him on the street corner saying, oh, yeah, I could have played big-time college ball. I could have played in the pros. I just needed to, if I had just stayed in school or, worked harder, whatever. And the coach just clearly has disdain for that kind of mentality. He's like, and that's all they're doing is just talking. They're just talking on a corner because they've never done anything. And it's, it's a harsh assessment, but it seems kind of accurate, at least when Bo is out there committing robberies and on drugs and, Arthur's dad, abandoning the family. So there's a lot of guys that maybe had the talent, but they never were able to stay on that path because it's a narrow path. And we see how hard William has to work at St. Joe's, and it does kind of just feel like Arthur has more fun at Marshall. Pingatore runs a very highly disciplined, structured, almost, kind of military. And you hear William say later, we could never just play. We could never just play ball and sort of be free and enjoy it. It was very regimented and so structured. And again, it's hard to make a judgment because that type of basketball, as Pingatore says, as Isaiah Thomas says at the basketball camp, that's winning basketball, right? Passing, always taking the right shot, not going too quickly. That's winning basketball. It's team basketball. That's what Pingatore preaches. But sports are also supposed to be fun, I think. And it seems like the Marshall team, they have fun, and they're the kind of team, if it was a movie, we would root for them. Like, they would be the team that we're following on their improbable run, through the state championship. And through the tournament. They don't quite get to the state championship, but they get close. And meanwhile, St. Joe's, it just feels dour. It feels joyless, And we get all those scenes of Pingatore yelling at the players. And I don't know. You guys can form your own opinions, but I think I would rather play at Marshall. And I don't know. Pingatore his attitude towards William really seems to shift maybe after the injury. He seems to really question how tough William is, or how much he wants it. And some viewers have wondered if maybe Pingatore uses some racially coded language at times, especially earlier when he's talking about Arthur. Not so much when he talks about William. I think he just sort of questions William's toughness. But with Arthur, we hear him say something like, oh, he's got some talent, but he's immature, undisciplined. And, those would be words that old white guys would often use to describe young African Americans. Doesn't have to be racial, but then he also says that Arthur sometimes reverts back to his environment. Which, again, I think we get what he means by that, and we get that Arthur doesn't come from a great environment, and Arthur acknowledges that too. But some people just sort of feel icky with Pingatore, and I want you guys to decide how you feel. Like, just his relationship with these young, mostly African American kids. And he does seem to want to help them to an extent. It seems very transactional. He wants them to go to school, play ball, go to college, but once they're not super useful to him and the team's chances to win, he seems to kind of lose interest. And I'm struck that he really puts the decision on William as to when to come back from that knee injury. So, William injures his knee, tears, I think, the meniscus or, some kind of cartilage in his knee. He comes back, but he doesn't quite seem right. But Pingatore lets him decide if he wants to play. And I don't know, maybe it's partly the dated nature of the film. Maybe, I don't know. I mean, I didn't play high school sports. I don't know that much about how it works. But I just feel like in the modern day, at a big-time program like St. Joe's, I feel like they would have had a training staff, a medical staff that would have made that decision for the player. Players are generally going to want to play. And you're talking about a 16 or 17-year-old kid. That seems like a pretty big decision to put on his shoulders. So William elects to play, and then he re-injures himself. And then I think he gets hurt at that camp, at that summer camp, even though it's not directly related to it's not the knee, but it seems like it might be related to that initial injury. It's some kind of muscle injury, but seems like he loses his confidence, and it certainly doesn't seem like Pingatore is the guy that's going to help you get your confidence back. He seems like he's really kind of helping William to lose it. But I think there's another way to read him. I think other people just read him as kind of a tough love disciplinarian. And again, if you played a lot of sports, you might have had coaches like that. And some people respond well to that kind of coaching. But it is interesting to just juxtapose St. Joe's with Marshall. And Marshall's coach is not like a super laid-back guy. I mean, he's a disciplinarian too, and he certainly yells at the players. But just watching them play, watching the interaction between the players, Arthur and his teammates, they just seem to be having fun. And they have more success than St. Joe's. Ultimately, St. Joe's goes out of the playoffs early. And William, he has a pretty good senior year, but I think he misses a critical shot late, and then earlier, he had those missed free throws. So just some really agonizing stuff happens to William, and St. Joe's doesn't have the kind of success as a program that they expect to have. Meanwhile, Arthur flourishes, and Marshall wins the city championship, which is a pretty big deal. That's like all the public schools in the city. So Marshall is the best out of that group, and then they go to the big state tournament, which is played, they say downstate. They refer to going downstate, and that means going down to Champaign, Illinois, which is where the University of Illinois is, and I think that's where they play the state tournament. So after winning the city championship, Marshall is able to go downstate. They pull an upset and beat a bigger, better team with some future NBA player is on their team. I can't remember the guy's name, but he was the big star that team was known for. And Arthur and company, they win that game, and then they lose, I think, a heartbreaker in the next round. But they're really far. They're in the semifinals. They end up finishing third in the state, which is really good. And Arthur is able to generate some attention from college scouts. As we saw, William was getting attention back when he was a freshman. So again, how do we feel about that? It's another big part of the narrative. Just the sports industrial complex, school sports industrial complex, if we want to use that expression. Just the amount of money and just the big business of it all. Recruiting kids. Again, we've already seen Earl Smith recruiting really young kids, basically recruiting for high schools. And then we see that colleges are recruiting high school freshmen, high school sophomores. Just this deluge of letters and, promotional material. Staggering. At one point you see that suitcase. It's like a suitcase in Williams's lap, and it's just full of letters from colleges, but we can see, I mean, if you're paying attention, by the end of the film, a lot of those colleges don't seem to be recruiting William anymore. He's still viewed as a good prospect, but that injury has dimmed his star a little bit. But he does end up going to Marquette, which is a pretty good basketball program, Division I. It's in Milwaukee. And he plays. He is on the team, but as we learn in like the postscript at the very end, he leaves the team briefly. He kind of becomes disillusioned. There's a lot of sadness that seems wrapped up with William by the end of his high school career, because it didn't go the way it was supposed to go, and he didn't emerge as the kind of star that he had been anointed as back when he was, 14. So the expectations, the weight placed on these kids, even with the college recruitment, it's very intense. And then the minute the kid gets hurt, or it looks like he might not be as good as they thought, a lot of the schools just drop him. They're just gone. They forget about him. And even his own coach seems kind of ready to move on. Like, okay, William's a nice kid. He's a pretty good player, but he doesn't have that killer instinct. So let me bring in the new crop of kids and we'll try to do better. So it's a relentless business, and it's kind of unmerciful. If you're good enough and you can make it and you get some good breaks, yeah, that path is there for you. And again, Isaiah Thomas is kind of the mythological figure that represents that success. But it's hard to stay on that path, and Williams seems to get knocked off of it really through no fault of his own. It seems to be largely the injury. But he does grow disillusioned with the game. Meanwhile, Arthur, ends up getting some attention from college scouts, not big-time schools, and his grades aren't very good. So he has to go the junior college route, which is what William's brother had done. But Arthur, in a lot of ways, like in a sort of pragmatic sense, Arthur becomes a success story. He goes to that junior college, whatever it's called, Mineral Valley, I don't know, that small junior college in southern Missouri. He plays there, does well, and ends up getting a scholarship to Arkansas State University, which is not quite as big time as Marquette. It's still a Division I school, but kind of a smaller league, not like a really high-profile school, but he's on scholarship. He goes and he plays, and unlike William, who's just kind of a backup at Marquette, and he's kind of on and off the team, Arthur becomes a really good player at Arkansas State. He becomes their starting point guard. He's not like a household name. Like if you hadn't seen Hoop Dreams, if you're a casual basketball fan, you're probably not gonna know who Arthur Agee was, but he became a pretty good, actually a quite good player at kind of a smaller D1 school. Wasn't good enough to play in the NBA, but he did have a professional career. He went overseas and played in some leagues in other countries. He can make a decent living doing that, going to countries like Italy, Greece, Turkey. They have their own leagues over there. And then he played in some kind of like minor leagues, smaller leagues in the U.S., but never made it to the pros. But if we're just thinking about, getting kids out of these difficult circumstances and just putting them on a path to a good life, sort of a normal life, a middle-class life, go to college, get a degree, go and get a job, Arthur kind of did that. He went the JUCO route, junior college. He ended up at the four-year school, became a good player, finished school, and actually made a living playing basketball for a little while. Williams' career was not as successful, but at least basketball does get him into college. It's at least the driving force behind getting him into college, and he is able to eventually finish at Marquette. But again, we learn about their lives, all these other things that are happening in their lives. William becomes a father at a very early age. And I did forget to mention this, just speaking of his new family. His girlfriend, I think, has a spot-on assessment of Pingator. I want you guys to pay attention to that conversation between William and his girlfriend. It comes around the 1 hour, 45-minute mark, and she calls Pingator stingy and selfish. And she reveals something that I don't think we had previously known, which is Pingator didn't want William to miss a game to go and be present for the birth of his daughter, the birth of his first child. And she uses that as evidence that Pingator only cares about winning. And I don't disagree with her, but it's really interesting, really telling to listen to William's response. William defends Pingator. He doesn't agree with his girlfriend. He defends Pingator's decision, and he refers to the birth of his child in this really weird, vague way as like an occurrence or like an incident. He's like, Coach can't, just give time off for any occurrence, And she's like, but it's the birth of your daughter. It's a big deal. And he's like, but it was the state tournament. We had a lot going on. So he's kind of adopted this way of thinking where winning is key. It takes priority over everything, over family, and maybe over your physical well-being. Because, I think it's made pretty clear to William that they want him to play. He's under an enormous amount of pressure. And instead of kind of taking some of that pressure off, Pingator just seems to put it on him and say, if you feel ready, get out there and you got to perform. And, yeah, so anyway, but that I just forgot. I wanted to point out that scene, but we do learn a little bit about his family life. And that's obviously an added challenge. We see him reconnect briefly with his father. That's an interesting scene. His father hasn't really been in his life. And, William seems a little wary of him for good reason. And then the same with Arthur, right? We see his family go through their struggles. But we see a lot of generosity and a lot of triumph, I think particularly through the lens of Arthur and his family. Again, I mentioned Sheila. We learned that at one point they take in Arthur's friend, Shannon, and, he comes to live with them. Arthur's older sister is back living there with her child. So, they're making the best of these difficult circumstances, and Shannon ends up getting in trouble later. He's kicked off the team. He later gets arrested for selling drugs. So, again, so many people let Arthur down. I mean, again, there's tragedy mixed in with the triumph. His dad lets him down. His best friend goes down the wrong path, and that seems to really hurt Arthur. Later, he gets robbed. He's held at gunpoint. So by the end of the film, you really get the sense that he wants out of the west side of Chicago. He wants out. He wants to go and chase his basketball dream, and he's able to do that. But again, these are kind of familiar stories of American inner cities. We've seen these kind of stories depicted in other films, works of fiction. But here, it's real. We have real faces to put to these struggles and to put to these stories. So I think that makes us feel the stories a lot more closely. And again, one of my favorite parts of the movie, Marshall's run in the playoffs. It's a screenwriter's dream. They go downstate. We see Sheila graduate. We see the drama with Bo. And then we see William's arc, which kind of goes a different way. But there's some heartwarming scenes there as well. When both of them graduate, when they have their family get-togethers, we can feel good about that. But there are other times where we're forced to ask really difficult questions about sports and about this relationship between schools and sports. If you ever talk to people from other countries, I've been told by some people that I've met over the years that they find our whole notion of like scholastic sports in this country to be very strange. high school sports, college sports, how seriously we take them in the U.S. Certainly, different sports are more popular in different regions, different areas of the country, but this is something that's a little bit uniquely American. Most other countries don't have collegiate athletics like we do, and they don't have the kind of emphasis on high school athletics typically that we do. I mean, if you guys are going back through the film, just go back to some of the game footage, which is really good, I think, and I like how they use it throughout the film. But look at some of those arenas. I mean, there's some small gyms, but then when we get to the big playoff games, they're in these big arenas. There's so many people, it's so loud. And again, it's high school sports, and some of you might be from parts of the country where high school sports are really big. I'm from the South where high school sports, especially football, not so much basketball like here, but football and like baseball are really big. A little bit more like Linklater, what we saw with that kind of sports culture in Texas back in Dazed and Confused. But maybe some of you grew up in places like this, or you were connected to it in some ways, but it is worth thinking about the pressure on these kids, the weight that they carry, and how much they have invested. When William gets hurt, just the mood shift in his family because he's the one they're hoping will get out. And the same with Arthur. I just remember there's a scene where recruiters are talking to his dad, and his dad's a difficult character to like at times, but this is one of the moments where this is one of the stretches where he's kind of cleaned up and he's watching Arthur's games and the scouts are talking to him, and he's saying, hey, he starts out kind of making a well-reasoned sort of argument. It's like, I'm leaning this way or that. But then he concludes by saying, I just thank God that somebody wants him. And it's really kind of a poignant moment, just that he just wants, and it sounds a little bad maybe at first, but I think he just is any school, any opportunity for Arthur is great. He just wants any chance for him to get out of there. And they get it, that Mineral Valley School. It's nothing special. We see the college, the basketball house for the college. It seems a little bit bleak, but I think it is kind of inspiring to think that Arthur makes it. He gets through school there, and he goes to a big school, and he graduates, and he really does sort of achieve his dream on a more practical level, not of making it to the NBA. That might have been the initial childhood dream, boyhood dream, but he does kind of live the dream of getting out of his neighborhood and becoming somewhat successful. So, yeah, but the system is certainly worth examining, and we have a lot of interesting characters to think about as well. And just kind of the final question about the players, is it possible for ball players to be both kind of privileged because they are in some ways? Like we even hear Williams' guidance counselor say, you must be really good at basketball to have these schools recruiting you with, some of your test scores and some of your not stellar grades. And again, we know these guys come to high school on a lower level because they've frankly come up through poorly funded inner city schools where they're not getting great educations necessarily. So they have to overcome that as well. That's another thread that we can follow through the story. But yeah, because they're good at ball, they get these opportunities, but can they also be exploited? Can athletes be both privileged and exploited at the same time? So just to wrap up, let's talk a little bit about the filmmaking style here. So obviously we have a less obtrusive technique compared to what we saw with Michael Moore and Roger and Me. James does not make himself a central part of the proceedings here, but as I've mentioned before, he is kind of involved. I mean, he knows Arthur and William. He spends a lot of time with them, obviously, and he also has sort of friendships with their families. He helps Sheila out a little bit with some of her money problems. So, and he's not totally absent. We hear his voice sometimes. We hear him ask some questions off camera. So he's not totally absent, but certainly not as present as Moore was. But overall, this is a more traditional style of documentary, a more traditional visual style. We could call it sort of cinema verite, once again, like very much realism, just capturing everyday life. You know, we're in these apartments, we're inside the houses, inside the kids' rooms, we're we're inside school, we're on the bus, we're in the gym. They obviously filmed a lot of basketball footage, a lot of the actual games, a lot of the game footage, which I think they've done really well with. Like I said, it's well edited. They don't show us too much. They just show us the most dramatic moments. And basketball is, of course, a pretty aesthetically pleasing sport when you take out all the stoppages, all the timeouts, the huddles, and you can just see the guys running up and down the court, making shots, dunking and all that. So we get the fun sort of upbeat, up-tempo basketball action, but then we get a lot of these scenes with just the characters, talking, existing in their normal everyday spaces. But you can see how big editing is here. We talked about editing a little bit with Moore's film, but obviously they had to really make a coherent narrative out of this like forest of footage, So Marks, like I said, James's buddy Marks was the initial editor, but they had to bring in some reinforcements because the editing was such a labor-intensive undertaking. But yeah, I don't think there's anything that really maybe jumps out at us that much about the visuals, but we do have some camera movement. It's not a boring film to watch, even though we do spend a lot of time just in rooms listening to people talk or just sort of walking around. But we do get some pans. Again, we get a lot of camera movement sometimes when we're looking at the city. We're sometimes looking at it seemingly from a car window. But again, there seems to be an emphasis on some of these urban spaces, and we definitely get a sense of movement when we're going out to St. Joe's, because again, we're going out into the suburbs, we're leaving the city, we're leaving the worlds that Arthur and William know. And then later when they go downstate, if you've ever been to Illinois, you know that like the central to southern part of Illinois is a lot of farmland. It's a lot of like just like cornfields and just kind of like endless prairie kind of. People think Illinois, they think Chicago, but of course Chicago's way up north in the northern part of the state. They're coming down south, and it's very different. So you get this sense that they're leaving, familiar land and sort of striking out into this new land. So we do get movement, we get some dynamic camera action, but we also get an emphasis, I think, on urban desolation. There's, sometimes when we're seeing characters walk around, like we're watching Arthur, like walk in his neighborhood, I almost get sort of like a post-apocalyptic feel, like these empty lots, these dilapidated buildings, really sort of desolate urban space that, again, underscores the drama, of the journey and the stakes that are at play here, that we can see. But again, we see a lot of different courts, and there's kind of a poetry to the way they photograph the different basketball courts. Sometimes they feel, even the courts themselves feel kind of barren, kind of lonely. Sometimes they're under elevated train tracks. Sometimes they're just in kind of almost like these wasteland spaces. So you can think about that, the physical sense of setting that we get here, our actual time and place, which again is sort of late 80s, early 90s, mostly in these inner city neighborhoods. So just to kind of briefly wrap up, just kind of some additions to the postscript. Agee's dad was actually murdered during an apparent robbery attempt back in 2004, which I think is a very sort of sad conclusion to his to his sort of narrative. But just on a brighter note, and again, this is a little bit in the weeds, and if you don't care about sports, that's fine. But there is a player. He's not a star, but there's a player in the NBA right now named Patrick Beverley. And if you're an NBA fan, you might know who he is. He's kind of well known to basketball junkies. But Beverley's from the west side of Chicago. He went to Marshall High, just like Arthur did, and was kind of mentored by Arthur a little bit, knew Arthur during his playing career. Anyway, he went on to play college basketball at University of Arkansas, not Arkansas State, University of Arkansas, which is a bigger school, a pretty big-time basketball program. He was a star in college, got drafted, and plays in the NBA. He's not a star player in the NBA, like I said, but he does play. He plays for Minnesota. They're in the playoffs right now. So another example of a success story, right? But it just feels like for every Isaiah Thomas, there's an Arthur. And for every Patrick Beverley, there's a William. It's just a brutal way. It's a do or die way to try to make it. And just one more note, AG, like I said, Arthur went on to have a brief professional career, or maybe somewhat extensive. I'm not really sure what he's up to these days as far as his line of work, but in 1999, he took a small acting role in a film called Passing Glory, directed by Steve James, a fiction film set, I want to say, in 1960s New Orleans. I don't know. I haven't seen the film, but it's about it's back before school integration. So it's like an all-black high school playing an all-white high school in the segregated South in the 60s. I don't know much about it. It aired on TNT back in '99. And again, this was a film directed by James. A.G. Arthur had a small role in the film. And I don't know. I've heard that maybe he's done some other acting, but I just haven't been able to find a lot of info about that. But James has had a pretty active career, hasn't made a lot of other really big films, and he hasn't had too many other forays into fiction film. Obviously, Hoop Dreams will always be the best thing that he's ever done. So I hope you guys have a lot to say about the film, and please get in touch with me soon. We're going to start talking a little bit about the final paper ideas. I would like to talk to all of you individually before our final stuff is due. So we'll get to that a little bit more in our weeks to come, but we only have 2 more films to go. So we're getting near the end. If you have any questions or if you need anything, please get in touch, and I'll see you next week.